I told my absent father's new family to leave me alone forever. 20 hours. That's how long my father decided to be a full-time parent before he gave up on me. I'm 20 now, and I'm exhausted. Not the kind of tired you fix with coffee or a good night's sleep. It's the bone-deep exhaustion that comes from spending your entire life being someone's afterthought. And now I'm dealing with the collateral damage of his lies. My parents were never together. They had me, and that was pretty much it. For the first 7 years of my life, my father existed in my world the same way a character actor shows up in a TV series. Brief appearances, usually disappointing, then gone again until the writers needed him for another episode. He'd charm my maternal grandparents during pickup, take me out for an afternoon of half-hearted activity, then disappear back into whatever life he was actually living. The pattern was predictable. Show up, pretend, vanish. My real life was with my mom and my grandparents. They were my foundation. My father was just background noise. Then everything detonated when I was 7. My mother died. It wasn't a long illness where you get time to prepare or say goodbye. It was sudden and brutal, the kind of loss that fractures your entire understanding of safety. One day, she was there, and then she wasn't. And I was a 7-year-old kid trying to understand why the most important person in my world had simply stopped existing. In the aftermath, while I was drowning in grief I didn't have words for, the legal system made what looked like a logical decision on paper. My father became my custodial parent. Automatic. Simple. Except there was nothing simple about being handed over to a man who was essentially a stranger. I remember those 20 hours with the kind of clarity that trauma burns into your brain. I was taken to his house, a place that smelled wrong and felt wrong and didn't have a single corner that reminded me of my mother. The silence there was different from any silence I'd known. It wasn't comfortable or safe. It was empty. He didn't know what to do with a grieving child. He didn't know my favorite foods or what helped me sleep or how to comfort me when I cried. He didn't even know what toys I liked. 20 hours. That's how long he lasted before he decided being a father to his traumatized, freshly orphaned 7-year-old son was too much work. He drove me back to my grandparents' house. There was no tearful explanation, no promise that he'd figure it out and come back for me. It was purely transactional. He was returning a responsibility he'd never wanted in the first place. I remember standing in my grandparents' doorway with my small backpack, watching him drive away, understanding on some level that I'd just been rejected for the second time in less than a month. First by death, then by choice. My grandparents stepped up without hesitation. They became my parents in every way that mattered. But the system doesn't make it easy to love a child when you're the grandparents and the biological father is still alive and legally responsible. They had to sue him for child support. Think about that. They had to go to court and fight for the bare minimum financial contribution from a man who shared half my DNA, but zero of my daily life. And here's the part that still makes my blood pressure spike. While they were suing him for support, he had the audacity to sue them for visitation rights. He didn't want the work of raising me, but he wanted the appearance of being a father. He wanted weekend visits and summer weeks that he could point to as evidence he was involved. The court gave him what he asked for: mandated visitation. Court-ordered father-son time. And even with a legal requirement, he barely showed up. The financial support was sporadic at best. Sometimes the checks would come regularly for a few months, then nothing for half a year. My grandparents never said anything to me about it, but I'd see my grandmother's face tighten when she checked the mail, and I'd know. The visits were just as unreliable. I'd go an entire year without seeing him. Then he'd suddenly show up demanding his court-appointed time like I was supposed to be grateful. And the visits themselves? They were worse than his absence. Sometimes he'd pick me up, drive me somewhere, and then leave me with whoever was convenient. A friend, an acquaintance, some woman he was dating. He'd drop me off like I was a package that needed temporary storage while he went and did whatever was actually important to him. I spent court-ordered father-son time being babysat by strangers. I'd sit in their living rooms, watching TV, eating snacks they'd offer out of pity, waiting for him to remember to come back. The message was clear every single time. I was an inconvenience. A legal obligation he resented. A burden on the life he actually wanted to live. Around the time I turned 15, things shifted on the surface. He got his act together in the way adults describe when someone starts showing up to work on time and pays their bills. He had a steady job. He called a little more often. The promises sounded slightly less empty, but none of it changed the fundamental reality. He was still mostly absent. He was just a more financially solvent version of absent. For me, it didn't matter. You can't rebuild a foundation that was never poured in the first place. He could have shown up in a three-piece suit with a corner office, and it wouldn't have changed the 7 years of neglect, or the 20 hours of abandonment, or the countless visits where I wasn't worth his time. When I was 17, I found out he'd gotten married. It wasn't news he delivered personally. It was just information that made its way to me through some channel I don't even remember. He had a wife. Okay, that was his business, not mine. Then that summer, he decided it was time to play Father of the Year. He informed my grandparents, not asked, informed, that I'd be spending 2 weeks with him, his new wife, and her children. It wasn't framed as an invitation. It was presented as his right, a flexing of the minimal custody arrangement that technically still existed on paper. My grandparents tried to push back, but he threatened to make it a legal issue, so I agreed to go. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't want to cause more problems for the people who actually loved me. The drive to his house felt like driving toward my own execution. My stomach was twisted the entire way. When I pulled up, I saw a house that looked like it belonged in a home improvement magazine. Perfect lawn, perfect shutters, offensively normal. The moment I walked through the door, I was hit with an enthusiasm I wasn't remotely prepared for. His wife was all over me with this practiced warmth that felt like a performance. "Oh my God, it's so wonderful to finally meet you. We've heard so much about you." She was beaming, touching my arm, trying to pull me into this narrative where we were already a family. Her kids were just as intense. They were younger than me by a couple years, and they'd clearly been hyped up for weeks about their cool new older brother. "Wait till you see the gaming setup. We can teach you how to skateboard. Do you like pizza? We're ordering pizza tonight." They were bouncing around me like puppies, completely innocent and entirely overwhelming. I felt like I couldn't breathe. His wife kept talking, asking questions about school, about my hobbies, about my future. She wanted to know my favorite movies, my favorite foods, whether I played sports. She was performing the role of the perfect stepmother, and every second of it felt like nails on a chalkboard. These people have been fed a story, a version of me and my relationship with my father that didn't exist. They thought they were meeting someone who'd been waiting for this moment. They had no idea they were trying to bond with someone who'd spent 13 years learning that my father didn't care. I spent those 2 weeks perfecting the art of avoidance. I stayed in the guest room as much as possible, only coming out for meals. When they were in the living room, I found reasons to be outside. When they went outside, I stayed in. I gave one-word answers. I avoided eye contact. I made my discomfort so obvious that even the kids started to notice. Their initial excitement curdled into confusion, then hurt. They couldn't understand why their new older brother acted like being near them was painful. The wife started looking at me with this mix of concern and frustration, like I was a puzzle she couldn't solve. One evening, she cornered me in the kitchen while I was trying to make a sandwich and escape back upstairs. "Sweetheart," she started, and I hated the word immediately. "I need to ask you something. You've been here over a week, and you haven't spent any real time with the family. Why are you so unwilling to get to know me and the kids?" They're really disappointed. I didn't answer. I kept my eyes on the refrigerator, gripping my plate, waiting for her to stop talking. She kept going. She asked why my father and I weren't spending time together, like I was the one who'd been consistently unavailable for 13 years. She seemed genuinely bewildered, like she couldn't comprehend why I wasn't thrilled about this opportunity. I still didn't say anything. I didn't trust my voice not to crack or my words not to turn into years of rage. Eventually, she stopped. I took my sandwich and left. I think she started asking my father the same questions, wondering why his long-lost son wasn't jumping for joy at the chance to have a shiny new family. I think my father realized his attempt at playing happy blended family was failing spectacularly, and the easiest solution was to let me leave. The 2-week visit got cut short. I went home to my grandparents' house before the month was even close to finished. That was the last time I saw or spoke to my father. The last time I saw his wife or her kids. That was 3 years ago. The silence after I left was instant relief. But even though I'd physically removed myself from the situation, the attempts at connection didn't stop. They just became external. I started getting invitations in the mail. Birthday parties for the kids. Thanksgiving dinner. Christmas. Every envelope that showed up at my grandparents' address went straight into the trash without being opened. Then came the cards. Birthday cards with my name written in neat, feminine handwriting. Christmas cards, always with gift cards inside, like money could buy a relationship. I knew they weren't from my father. The handwriting was too careful, too neat. It was her, his wife, the woman trying desperately to stitch together a family that didn't exist. The gift cards piled up on my desk and used. A physical representation of every boundary I was trying to maintain. I didn't want their money. I didn't want their invitations. I didn't want any piece of the life my father had built after deciding I wasn't worth the effort. I was 20. I was in college. I was building a future that had absolutely nothing to do with the man who helped create me. Then, a few weeks ago, my phone rang. Unknown number. I usually let those go to voicemail, but I've been waiting for a call about a campus job, so I answered without thinking. It was her. The moment I heard her voice, every muscle in my body tensed. Years of resentment solidified in my chest like concrete. She started carefully, apologetically. I know this is out of the blue, but I really needed to talk to you. I didn't say anything. She kept going. She told me she'd only found out the truth after I left that summer. Apparently, my father had constructed an entire alternate reality to explain my absence. He'd told her he moved around a lot for work when I was younger, and I'd wanted to stay in one place with my grandparents for stability. He claimed he saw me every single month without fail. He said we had a good relationship. He even told her I was excited to meet her and her kids, that I was looking forward to being a big brother and having a mother figure. Every word she said felt like a punch. He hadn't just neglected me. He'd actively lied to cover up the neglect. He'd built this narrative where he was a devoted father, and I was the kid who just preferred living with my grandparents. He'd erased 20 hours. He'd erased court battles and missed payments and years of absence. Then she told me she was pregnant, or trying to get pregnant, or had just had a baby. Honestly, the details blurred because my brain was trying to process the idea of a half-sibling, another kid growing up in the family my father had chosen over me. But she moved past it quickly, pivoting to what she really wanted. She wanted me to have a relationship with her kids. She framed it as this beautiful, low-pressure opportunity to have more family. She said her kids still talked about me, that they'd been so disappointed when I left, that they deserved to have the big brother they'd been promised. We could meet for lunch, she offered, her voice gaining momentum like she thought she was close to convincing me. Somewhere public, wherever you're comfortable. I'd happily pay for whatever you want. It doesn't have to be a big responsibility, just a connection. She kept talking, kept pushing, kept trying to package this disaster as something positive. And something inside me snapped. Not into anger, into clarity. All the years of my father's intermittent presence, the 20 hours of abandonment, the court battles, the neglect, the gaslighting, it all crystallized into a single, cold certainty. I cut her off mid-sentence. My voice was steady, calm, completely devoid of emotion. Look, I said, and the word landed heavy. I appreciate you telling me your side of this, and I'm genuinely sorry he lied to you. But I need you to understand something, and I need you to understand it clearly so we never have to have this conversation again. I paused, let the silence stretch. I'm not interested. I'm never going to be interested in a relationship with you or your children, regardless of whether you have a child with him or not. That's not my family. I do not consider him my family, and I have absolutely nothing to do with that side of things. It holds zero interest for me. It never will. I wasn't confessing. I wasn't explaining. I was stating a fact with the finality of a door slamming shut. She recoiled. I could hear it in her breath. Please, she started, voice cracking. You need to reconsider. Think about the kids. I'm hanging up now, I said. And I did. I ended the call before she could say another word. I thought that was it. I thought I'd finally made myself clear enough that even someone determined to ignore boundaries would understand. I was wrong. A week later, a thick envelope showed up at my grandparents' house. Formal looking. My name on the front in that same neat handwriting. I opened it and found 5 pages. Front and back. Single-spaced. I skimmed the first page and a half, and that was all I could stomach. It was a guilt trip wrapped in a plea wrapped in emotional manipulation. She wrote about how her kids cried asking why I didn't want them, how she felt powerless because she hadn't known the truth, how I needed to consider their feelings, how I could stop them from experiencing the pain of rejection, stop them from experiencing rejection by showing up and pretending to care. That was her solution. My emotional labor was supposed to fix the consequences of my father's lies. The audacity was breathtaking. I didn't finish reading it. I tore the letter into pieces, not out of anger, but out of need to physically destroy the attempt to worm back into my life. Now I'm sitting here, trying to process everything, and I can't stop thinking about her words. Consider the kids. They're innocent. They didn't ask for any of this. They're just children who were told they have a big brother, and then I showed up and wanted nothing to do with them. My grandparents tell me I have every right to choose who's in my life. They support me completely. But I keep thinking about those kids' faces from that summer. The confusion, the hurt. My father is the villain here. He's the architect of all this pain. He's the one who abandoned me, who lied to his wife, who created this entire mess. But by rejecting her and her children so completely, so coldly, am I becoming a villain too? A smaller one, maybe, but still someone causing pain. I keep telling myself I owe them nothing. I didn't create this situation. I'm not responsible for fixing the damage my father caused. But the thought of those kids asking why their big brother doesn't want them keeps creeping back into my head late at night when I can't sleep. Am I the asshole for telling my absent father's wife that I'm never going to be interested in a relationship with her or her children, regardless of whether she has kids with my father or not? Am I wrong for drawing this boundary so harshly, even though the cost is their confusion and hurt? I need to know if I'm protecting myself or just passing trauma down the line. After I hung up on her and tore up that letter, I genuinely believed the story was over. I thought I could shove it back into the corner of my brain where I keep everything related to my father and let it collect dust. I thought I'd finally made myself clear enough that even the most persistent person would get the message. But this situation didn't fade quietly. A few days after I destroyed the letter, my grandfather got a phone call from her. She'd somehow decided that calling the home of the people who raised me was an appropriate next step. He didn't tell me about it right away. I only found out because I overheard him telling my grandmother that the woman's voice had been shaking, that she'd sounded more scared than anything else. All she'd asked was whether I'd received her letter. My grandfather, who has never raised his voice in the entire time I've known him, told her in the coldest tone I've ever heard from him that I had received it, that I'm an adult capable of making my own decisions, and that she was never to contact me again. He told her he wouldn't allow her to worm her way into the life of the child she and her husband had both abandoned emotionally. He hung up before she could respond. When he told me about the call, I felt something I wasn't prepared for. Guilt. Not guilt for rejecting her or her kids. Not guilt for setting a boundary. But guilt for dragging my grandparents back into the orbit of a man who'd hurt them too. A man who'd turned their 50s and 60s into an emergency crash course in raising a traumatized child. They'd never once made me feel like a burden, but for the first time, I felt like I'd brought that toxic world back into our home. My grandmother noticed I wasn't eating much. I was getting headaches. My sleep was completely wrecked. Every time my phone lit up, my stomach would clench like someone had shoved a fist inside me. One night, about a week later, I walked into the kitchen at midnight to get water and found my grandmother sitting alone at the table with one of my childhood photo albums open in front of her. She wasn't crying, but she looked exhausted in a way I hadn't seen since I was a kid. When she noticed me, she smiled softly and patted the chair next to her. I sat down, silent, because I didn't want to invite a conversation I wasn't ready for. But she opened the album anyway, turning to a section I recognized immediately. The months right after my mother died. There were photos of me asleep on her lap, because the nightmares had been so bad she hadn't dared move. Photos of my grandfather teaching me to ride a bike, anything to distract me from asking why my father hadn't called that week. Photos of the tiny bed they'd set up in their room, because I kept waking up screaming for my mother. I couldn't look at the pictures for long. It felt like staring at a child who'd been abandoned twice. Once by fate, once by blood. My grandmother eventually spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Sweetheart, you are allowed to love yourself more than the children of the man who didn't love you." And something inside me broke open. I didn't sob. I didn't wail. I just leaked silent tears like a faucet someone forgot to turn off. I think it was the first time in years I'd let myself feel like a child again. Not the hardened adult setting boundaries with strangers, but the hurt little boy who'd been dropped off at a house that wasn't home by a man who didn't want him. Then she came to the house. She didn't barge in or cause a scene. She stayed on the public sidewalk, but she stood there for almost 15 minutes holding a piece of paper, clearly debating whether to knock. My grandfather opened the door before she could gather the courage. I don't know what he said. He made sure I stayed inside, but I watched through the window. Even from a distance, she looked like someone who wasn't sleeping, someone who'd been crying, someone unraveling in her own way. She didn't yell. She didn't try to force her way in. She just handed my grandfather another letter and left. He tore it in half without reading it and dropped it into the kitchen trash. "We are not entertaining this," he told me gently but firmly. That should have been the end. But when someone shows up physically at your home, when they insert themselves into your actual reality, it changes something. I felt exposed, violated, like my safe place suddenly had cracks in the walls. I didn't read that second letter, but my grandmother did. Not because she wanted drama or didn't respect my boundary. She read it because she was worried this woman might be unstable enough to escalate, and she wanted to know what we were dealing with. She didn't show me the letter, but she told me what it said. Calmly, quietly, in a way that somehow made everything worse. The wife had written about how the kids cried asking why I didn't want them, how she felt powerless because she didn't know the truth when I visited, how she's pregnant now and doesn't want her baby to grow up in a cycle of abandonment, how she believes God put me in their life for a reason, how she wants the new baby to know their big brother, how she's afraid her marriage is falling apart, how she doesn't know how to reconcile my father's lies with her reality. But the worst part, the part that made me feel like I'd swallowed stones. I know you were abandoned. I know you were hurt. But please don't punish my children for the sins of a man who also hurt me. My grandmother folded the letter into tiny squares and burned it in the sink. She didn't let me touch it, didn't let me dissect it, didn't let me latch on any piece of guilt-inducing manipulation. But she couldn't shield me from the weight of those words. About a week after the driveway incident, my phone rang again. This time, it was my father. I didn't answer. I let go to voicemail. The message he left still makes my hands shake when I think about it. He wasn't angry. He wasn't yelling. He just sounded exhausted, older than he had any right to sound. "I know you don't want anything to do with me," he said, voice rough. "I've earned that. But she's breaking. She thinks this is her fault. The kids are confused. I don't know what to do." He made a sound that was half sigh, half sob, and my stomach twisted. "You're allowed to hate me, but please don't hate them." That was it. No apology, no ownership, no recognition of his role in creating this entire disaster. Just a plea asking me to fix something I didn't break. I deleted the voicemail, but I can't delete the way it made me feel. Since then, the wife hasn't contacted me again. My father hasn't either. My grandparents have become fiercely protective, checking the mail before I do, screening calls. I started therapy again. Not, I should start therapy. I actually sat in a room with a therapist who asked me to describe the feeling I get when I hear the words "big brother," and I cried harder than I have in years. I don't know if I made the right choice. I don't know if there even was a right choice. What I do know is this. I spent 13 years being someone's afterthought. I spent 20 hours learning I wasn't worth the effort. I spent my entire childhood understanding that I was less important than whatever life my father actually wanted to live. I'm not going to spend my adulthood being the emotional support for the family he built after deciding I wasn't enough. Maybe that makes me cold. Maybe it makes me cruel, but also makes me free. And for the first time in my life, I'm choosing that freedom over guilt.
New stories every day. You know where to find me.